What's going on, everybody? It's ETAPRIME back here again. Today we're going to be putting together an all AMD small form factor gaming PC, and with this one I do want to try to keep the price down as much as possible. Plus, I've got a GPU that I personally haven't tested yet, one that I've been really wanting to get my hands on. So I figured we'd go ahead and throw it in this build. So with this, we're going to keep it small, we're going to keep it fast, and we're going to try to keep it as cheap as possible using new parts. Now, of course, if you want to go the used route or swap any of these out, it's totally up to you. And throughout the build, I will go over the parts used, also leave links in the description. And some of the stuff we're seeing right now actually didn't work out with the case I chose, so I did have to swap kind of on the fly, but we'll get to that in a second. Speaking of the case, this is one that I've seen quite a few times on Amazon. It's known as the S300. Now there's a couple different variants. One of them comes with a PCIe 3.0 riser. The other one does come with a PCIe 4.0 riser. Since we're using a newer 7000 series Radeon GPU, I wanted to get the version with that 4.0 riser. And this case is coming in at 8.1 liters. It's a lot smaller than I thought it would be, seeing videos and everything. I actually do like the handle, really easy to carry around. And in order to power everything in the case itself, you will need an SFX power supply. Obviously, since we have such a small form factor case, it only supports a mini ITX board, and I wanted to go with Ryzen 7000 here for the CPU. AM5 mini ITX boards aren't that cheap, but one of my favorites right now is actually the MSI Edge Wi-Fi B650. This is a great board, lots of great features built in. Now you could get out a bit cheaper going with an A620 board, it's really up to you in the end, but the CPU I opted to use here is one of my favorite Ryzen 7000s right now. It's the Ryzen 7 7700X, 8 cores, 16 threads, and yeah, Zen 4 cores, we're seeing some awesome CPU performance. AM5 only supports DDR5 RAM, and with this, I'm going with 64 gigabytes of DDR5 at 4800 megahertz, and the reason I'm not going something really fancy was because I ran into an issue with cooler height. I needed a low-profile AM5 CPU cooler, around 60 millimeters tall, so I opted to use the ID Cooling IS55, and the way this is set up, I can actually have it go over the I/O on the motherboard or the RAM, and the I/O is a bit too tall on this MSI board. So I opted to use this plain Jane DDR5 RAM, and it's going to get me by. I usually go with either 16 or 32 gigs, but I picked up a kit of 64, which is going to work out just fine for this setup here. But I gotta say, the main thing I'm worried about are CPU temps here, given that we're using a 55 millimeter cooler. It's pretty low. It's got a 120 millimeter fan on it. It's got a copper base plate and 5 heat pipes, but I haven't used this specific ID Cooling low profile cooler for this CPU yet, so we'll have to get everything together and see how it performs. Again, the case I opted to use is the S300, and I actually picked this up on Black Friday. It was on sale for around $69. Usually they're around $89, and this is the PCIe 4.0 version. So it comes with a 4.0 riser instead of a 3.0 riser, up to a 60 millimeter tall cooler, and it only supports an SFX power supply. Of course, you could go Pico if you wanted to do it that way, but I needed a little extra for the CPU and GPU combo that I got going here. Initially, I was going to go with a fully modular power supply, 700 watt. But again, I wanted to keep the price as low as possible here, building Ryzen 7000, so I went with a cheaper power supply. I've actually used one of these in the past. It's a 500 watt. Now the only downside to this is it's not modular, so you will have a mess of wires. You can always clean this up, and we've only got one PCIe 8-pin connector on here. But that's perfect for this build because the GPU I opted to use only supports a single 8-pin. So now I need to go ahead and install the power supply. I'm going to get everything wired up, and then we'll move around back and install the GPU. And this is one I've been wanting to use for a little while now. It's actually the RX 7600, and the version that I have here is the ASRock Steel Legend. ASRock is known for their massive coolers. We've got a triple fan design here. Personally, I think the card itself looks awesome. We've got that white going with the white case, and it definitely looks a lot larger than the case itself, but believe it or not, it will fit. I did have to remove the screws on the front just to give me a little bit of pry room to get it in there, but it does go in here quite nicely once we get it by that lip in the front. This card has 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 VRAM, and it's actually rated for high and ultra 1080p gaming. Now there are games that we could run at 1440p, especially with some FSR, and if you want to go to your backlog, you could take it up even further if you wanted to. But this is one that I wanted to get my hands on due to the price and availability, and yeah, you can see it just slotted right down in there, and it actually goes really nicely with the whole setup. And I'll tell you, another reason I wanted to build with this card was SteamOS. Now, I will have a video coming up with SteamOS running on this PC. Well, we'll use a variant of it. But right now, we've got Windows 11 Pro installed, and I'm really interested to see what this thing can do. Definitely concerned about the CPU temps, given that we're using that 7700X with this really low-profile cooler. But with a little bit of tweaking and tuning, I think we'll be just fine. And overall, it did come out quite nicely. And initially, measuring everything out on paper, I was a little worried that this card wouldn't fit inside of the S300. But yeah, with just a little bit of wiggling, it sits in here just fine. Now, all that's really left to do is get everything updated here with Windows 11 Pro. And as you can see, we do have some RGB on that GPU. And even over on the other side, we've got that RGB fan. It seems nowadays that they're actually charging more for non-RGB parts. I mean, it would be nice with no lights. But in the end, I don't think it looks that bad. Alright, so here it is, got everything installed, everything updated, and it's been running really well. I've done a little bit of testing so far, but the first thing I wanted to take a look at were CPU temps. So we're actually idling around 53 to 55 degrees Celsius, not bad at all. This CPU can definitely pull some power, and I haven't limited the clock or anything like that on it. I was just worried about this because we've got that low profile cooler. Run a stress test here with CPU-Z, and you can see it does jump up pretty quickly, but it's pulling around 122 to 125 watts. If I leave it like this, yeah, we can hit thermal throttle with this, and the fan just kicked up to 100%, trying to keep it nice and cool. But remember, while we're gaming, we're not going to pull this kind of wattage, and it doesn't even get close to thermal throttling this CPU. Actually, pretty impressed with this little thing. Side panels are on the case right now, and we've got plenty of airflow. Next up, take a look at this GPU. Since I haven't tested the 7600 yet, at least the desktop variant, I wanted to see what we were really working with here. And just running a quick test here in GPU-Z doesn't stress us out enough to kind of get the wattage and maximum clocks. But there's one little tweak that I've done. I'm actually taking the power limit up, and it's not by much. So we can only go up by 12%. So that'll allow us to hit those clocks that we really want to. Make sure that's good. And an easy way to kind of see what we can do here is to run Furmark. As you can see, get a boost up to around 2900. And I've actually seen the wattage on this jump up to around 190 watts. So yeah, it can definitely pull a little bit of power, but the performance this thing's putting out is way better than I thought it would be. They definitely consider this a 1080p card, but I will be testing a couple things here and there at 1440p. But with that out of the way, the first thing I wanted to look at were some benchmarks that I ran on this system. 3D Mark Night Raid, 68,521. Firestrike, 29,429. And finally, we've got Time Spy with a pretty impressive 11,600. I actually wasn't expecting to see these kind of scores out of the RX 7600 in this system. But yeah, I mean, just judging by the synthetics, I think this build is going to put out some really decent gaming performance. And the first game we have here is God of War 1080p Ultra, no FSR. We're right there, getting an average of around 73 FPS. I actually thought it would be a bit higher here. We are at only 1080p Ultra, but we don't have any FSR, and that's something we can add to most games on the market right now. We're going to go to quality with it, and now instead of getting an average of around 74 FPS, we can average around 82 FPS, and we're just at FSR quality. Going down, balanced performance is just going to take it up even more. But personally, I don't even need FSR here. I think it's just fine the way it is at a native 1080 Ultra. And if you take a look at Afterburner, we're pulling around 195 watts with that GPU and around 70 on the CPU. Our temp only hit 69 degrees Celsius, and that's what I was talking about. We're not going to be pulling 120 watts here while gaming, so temps with this cooler are fine. If you're looking for a good card for fighting games, the 7600 definitely has you covered. Street Fighter 6 1440p Ultra. I also tested out Injustice 2 and Mortal Kombat 1. With MK1, I did have to drop the resolution down to high at 1440, but it handled it just fine. Here's Doom Eternal, and with this I probably should have just taken it up to 1440, seeing the performance we're getting out of this. We're at Ultra settings, 1080p, no resolution scale, and we're getting an average of around 196 FPS. This is awesome. And again, keep an eye on Afterburner. Maximum temp with this one was around 71 degrees Celsius. Spider-Man Miles Morales 1080p, very high settings, no FSR, no resolution scale whatsoever. We got an average of 111 FPS, and up in the air here, you're definitely going to get a lot more out of it. Seen it jump up to the 140s every once in a while. Really great performance with this one, and keep in mind, this is the Miles Morales version, but you're going to get the same kind of performance with Spider-Man Remastered. And the final game I wanted to test here did much better than I thought it would. Cyberpunk 2077 1080p Ultra with no FSR. I actually thought we'd have to introduce a little bit of FSR, and from the settings, if you go directly to Ultra, it's going to set it to auto. That's how the game works. Turn it off just to see what you can do. You're not going to have any kind of resolution scale, so we are at a true 1080p. So overall, I think it's a pretty nice little setup. I personally really do like this case, and I should have probably picked it up a little earlier. I have had this in my possession since Black Friday. It's been something I've been kind of going over, deciding what I wanted to build in it. And I think this 7600 is a little underrated. I know people are looking for the higher end cards for a lot cheaper, but if you want to go with some 1080p gaming, and even in some cases 1440, I think this is a pretty decent little setup. If you're interested in putting something like this together, I will leave links in the description to all the parts I used, and let me know in the comments below if you're interested in seeing something like SteamOS running on this. Since we've got that Radeon GPU, we could definitely install it, and I think in Linux, we'll also see some really great gaming performance. But that's going to wrap it up for this one, and like always, thanks for watching.